The restaurant went silent the moment the Mafia boss lifted his fork. Dominic Black, cold, untouchable, feared by all of Chicago, was about to take his first bite when a scream cut through the room. "Don't eat that." All heads snapped toward the doorway. The young woman stood there, thin, shivering, clothes soaked from the rain. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks red from the cold. But her eyes were full of sheer terror. She stumbled forward, nearly tripping over her own feet. "Please," she gasped, pointing at his plate. "Don't eat it. Please don't." Dominic's men reached for their guns instantly. Customers ducked. No one spoke, but the Mafia boss raised a hand, stopping everyone. "Why?" he asked, voice low. "Dangerous." "How do you know it's in my food?" The woman's lips trembled. "Because," she whispered, "because I saw the man who poisoned it." A ripple of shock swept through the room. Dominic's jaw tightened. His fork froze inches from the plate. His men exchanged looks. No one dared to breathe. And then the young woman said something that made even the Mafia boss's blood run cold. "He tried to poison me yesterday too." In that moment, the most feared man in Chicago realized this wasn't just an attempted hit. It was a message, a warning, and the key to everything was standing right in front of him, barefoot and shaking. Slowly, without breaking eye contact with the terrified girl, Dominic lowered his silver fork, placing it perfectly parallel to the poisoned meal that was meant to be his last. The moment the silver clinked against the fine porcelain, the paralyzing spell broke. His dark eyes flicked across the opulent dining room, calculating every possible angle of attack and every shadowed corner where an assassin might still be lurking. "Lock down all exits," Dominic commanded, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a serrated blade. "No one enters and absolutely no one leaves this building." Security protocols that had been flawlessly perfected over 20 years of brutal warfare snapped into immediate action. Men in tailored black suits drew heavy weapons from their holsters, forming an impenetrable human wall around his table. The young woman flinched as the metallic clatter of handguns echoing off the crystal chandeliers filled the air, her slender shoulders trembling violently beneath her soaked and ragged clothing. Dominic stood up from his chair, brushing past his heavily armed enforcer, and stepped directly into the line of fire to reach her. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone demanding but deliberately measured to keep her from bolting. "Clara," she breathed out, her teeth chattering from the freezing rain that was still dripping from her tangled hair onto the polished mahogany floorboards. "Clara," Dominic repeated softly, testing the sound of the name as if searching for a hidden trap within the syllables. "If what you are saying is the truth, whoever tried to kill me knows you are standing in this room right now." A fresh wave of absolute panic washed over her pale face. Dominic grabbed his heavy cashmere coat from the back of his chair and draped it over her shivering frame. It engulfed her completely, but it offered a temporary physical shield from the freezing air and the piercing, suspicious stares of his ruthless soldiers. "We are moving out," Dominic ordered, looking over his shoulder at his trusted underboss. "Bring the armored vehicle to the rear kitchen exit immediately and sweep the alleyway twice." The ornate wooden kitchen doors swung open violently as two burly guards hauled the terrified head chef out by his collar, demanding answers with fists raised, but Dominic completely ignored the violent commotion. His focus remained entirely on Clara. The entire restaurant had suddenly transformed into a gilded death trap, a fragile glass box waiting to be shattered by sniper fire or a rigged explosive device. He gripped Clara firmly by the elbow, his touch commanding, but careful not to break her already fragile state. "Stay right beside me," he whispered, guiding her swiftly toward the dimly lit hallway of the bustling kitchen. Pandemonium erupted behind them as the remaining wealthy patrons began to scream, finally realizing the lethal gravity of the situation. Kitchen staff scrambled out of the way, dropping silver trays and hot pans as Dominic and his heavily armed convoy pushed aggressively through the narrow stainless steel corridors. The heavy metal fire door at the back alley was kicked open, revealing the slick, rain swept streets of the dark Chicago night. A massive black armored sports utility vehicle was already waiting with its engine roaring loudly like a caged feast ready to strike. "Get her inside now," Dominic barked to his men while his sharp eyes scanned the dark brick fire escapes and empty metal dumpsters for any sign of movement. A shadow shifted suspiciously on a nearby rooftop, and one of the guards fired 2 deafening warning shots into the dark night sky, the thunderous echoes temporarily drowning out the heavy pouring rain. Clara covered her ears with both hands and let out a choked sob as strong hands practically lifted her into the back seat of the reinforced vehicle. Dominic slid in right beside her, slamming the heavy bulletproof door shut just as the tires screeched violently against the wet asphalt. The heavy vehicle launched forward, throwing them both back against the dark leather seats with bone-rattling force. The sudden transition from the brightly lit dining room to the suffocating darkness of the moving mobile fortress was entirely jarring. Streetlights stroked quickly across Clara's terrified face as she pulled his oversized black coat tighter around her trembling body, making herself look incredibly small. The silence inside the armored car was suddenly deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the heavy windshield wipers and the shallow, panicked breathing of the girl sitting next to him. Dominic sat rigidly upright, his strategic mind already racing 3 steps ahead, violently dismantling every confident assumption he had held about his supposedly impenetrable empire. Someone knew his private schedule intimately. Someone had successfully bypassed his private chef and extensive security detail. Someone desperately wanted him to know they could reach out and kill him anytime and absolutely anywhere. But the most terrifying and unpredictable variable in this entire deadly equation was the fragile young woman sitting mere inches away from him. She was clearly not a trained syndicate operative or a rival soldier sent to deliver a threat. She was a civilian, a desperate girl who had somehow seen completely through the cracks of a meticulously planned assassination plot. "We are going to a highly secure location," Dominic finally said, breaking the suffocating silence in the dark cabin. His deep voice was completely devoid of any false comfort, offering her only the harsh, unforgiving reality of their current situation. "Once we arrive there, you're going to tell me exactly what this man looked like, Clara. Every single minor detail you can possibly remember." She nodded slowly, her wide eyes reflecting the blurry neon lights of the passing city storefronts. She had miraculously saved his life tonight, but in doing so she had unknowingly stepped directly into the deadly crosshairs of a ruthless underworld war she could not possibly begin to understand. And Dominic Black, a man who survived this long by never leaving any loose ends, knew with absolute certainty that he could not let her out of his sight until the rain-soaked streets of Chicago were painted red with the blood of the phantom who dared to threaten his undisputed throne. The heavy steel doors of the underground safe house slammed shut behind them with a metallic thud that echoed like a vault, sealing them away from the rest of Chicago. Dominic led Clara into a stark, brightly lit interrogation room stripped of all the luxurious comforts he usually surrounded himself with, featuring only a solid steel table and 2 uncomfortable chairs. The air was frigid, smelling faintly of ozone and old dust, a sharp contrast to the rich aromas of the restaurant they had just fled. Clara stood near the center of the room, still shivering violently inside his oversized cashmere coat, her wet hair clinging to her pale cheeks. Dominic did not offer her a seat immediately, his predatory instincts demanding answers before he extended any further hospitality. "Tell me everything," he commanded, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register that made his hardened enforcers outside the door stand perfectly still. "You said this man tried to poison you yesterday. Where were you, and what exactly did he look like?" Clara wrapped her arms around her waist, her wide, terrified eyes darting around the cold concrete walls before finally locking onto his dark, scrutinizing gaze. "I sleep in an abandoned subway access tunnel near the south side," she began, her voice trembling but surprisingly clear in the silent room. "He came down there yesterday afternoon holding a paper bag full of food from a deli." He acted like he was just a concerned stranger wanting to help someone down on their luck. But I grew up on the streets, Mr. Black. I know what predators look like when they are pretending to be saviors. Dominic stepped closer, his imposing shadow falling over her small frame. Go on, he urged, his jaw tight. I pretended to be asleep, Clara continued, taking a shaky breath. I watched him through my eyelashes. He took out a small glass vial, the exact same one I saw the waiter carrying tonight before he poured it onto your plate. He dropped the liquid into a sandwich and left it by my makeshift bed. He wanted to see if it would kill me quickly without leaving a trace, testing the dosage on a nobody before he used it on you. The sheer, chilling calculation of the act made Dominic's blood run cold. This assassin was not just ruthless, he was methodical, treating human life like disposable laboratory rats to ensure his true target would not survive. Describe him, Dominic demanded, leaning forward and resting his hands flat on the cold steel table. Every single detail, Clara. Do not leave anything out. She squeezed her eyes shut, vividly recalling the nightmare. He was tall, maybe 6 feet and 2 inches, she said rapidly. He had dark hair, but it was heavily silvered at the temples. He wore a very expensive charcoal suit, but it hung off his frame awkwardly, like he had lost a massive amount of weight recently and had not bothered to get it tailored. Dominic felt a strange, cold prickle at the base of his neck, a phantom memory trying to force its way to the surface of his mind. What else? He pressed, his voice sharp and demanding. He had a very specific habit. Clara opened her eyes, demonstrating by rubbing her thumb and index finger together in a rapid, repetitive motion. He kept doing this with his right hand whenever he stopped moving, like he was rolling an invisible coin. And there was a scar, she added, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. A deep, jagged burn scar creeping up from his left wrist and disappearing underneath his expensive watch cuff, like the skin had melted and healed badly. The sterile air in the safe house suddenly felt completely stripped of oxygen. Dominic froze entirely, his broad shoulders stiffening as if he had just taken a bullet straight to the chest. The terrifying accuracy of her description hit him with the devastating force of a freight train. 6 feet and 2 inches. Silvering hair at the temples. The nervous tick with the fingers. The horrific burn scar on the left wrist. Every single detail aligned perfectly with a ghost. The man Clara was describing was Marcus Thorne, Dominic's former brother-in-arms, his trusted partner in building their criminal empire, and a man who was officially pronounced dead 15 years ago. Dominic had personally identified the charred remains after Marcus's vehicle exploded in a spectacular fireball on the interstate during a brutal territorial dispute. If Marcus was truly alive, breathing the same Chicago air and orchestrating hits with untraceable poisons, then the past 15 years of Dominic's undisputed reign were built on a colossal, unforgivable lie. The realization threatened to crack the very foundation of his sanity. Someone powerful had helped Marcus fake his death. Someone with limitless resources had hidden him away, nursing him back to health and plotting this exact revenge for over a decade. Dominic slowly backed away from Clara, his mind violently piecing together the catastrophic implications. If Marcus was the architect of tonight's assassination attempt, he would not stop at just poisoning a meal. Marcus knew every single weakness Dominic possessed, every hidden safe house, every financial vulnerability, and every loyal soldier in their ranks. The fact that Marcus had returned from the ashes meant that war was not just coming, it was already here, hiding in the shadows and striking from within. Clara watched his expression shift from cold calculation to absolute horror, her own fear spiking as she realized the magnitude of the monster she had just described. "You know him, don't you?" she asked, her voice cracking under the immense weight of the tension filling the room. Dominic looked at the young woman who had just shattered his reality, realizing that by keeping her alive, he possessed the only living witness who could identify a ghost. "Yes," Dominic finally answered, his voice devoid of all emotion as he prepared to plunge his entire empire into a bloodbath. He is a dead man who just declared war on Chicago. The suffocating realization that Marcus Thorne was still breathing demanded immediate and ruthless action, forcing Dominic to turn his paralyzing shock into cold, calculated warfare. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a heavily encrypted satellite phone, his dark eyes never leaving Clara as she huddled against the freezing concrete wall of the interrogation room. "Bring them all down here right now," Dominic ordered his head of security, his voice a low and terrifying growl that promised absolute devastation. "Lock the steel-reinforced doors behind them, and do not let anyone leave this bunker alive without my direct authorization." He severed the connection and turned his predatory focus back to the young woman who was currently the only person in Chicago he could entirely trust. The dinner tonight was arranged less than 24 hours ago to celebrate an incoming weapons shipment, Dominic explained, stepping closer to her but keeping his hands carefully at his side so as not to spook her further. The restaurant was completely bought out and the guest list was strictly limited to my 3 closest lieutenants, which means the man who tried to poison my plate did not act alone. He had high-level help from inside my own house. Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing back to the terrifying encounter in the damp subway access tunnel. When he was poisoning my food, he was talking to someone on a disposable cell phone, she whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the barren room. He told the person on the other end of the line that the timing had to be absolutely flawless, and he specifically thanked them for securing the restaurant reservations so quickly. Dominic clenched his jaw so hard his teeth threatened to crack under the immense pressure of his own rage. Every alliance he had built over the past 15 years was suddenly suspect, every shared drink and signed contract potentially tainted by a resurrected ghost. The heavy steel door groaned open, revealing his 3 most trusted advisors, looking deeply unsettled by the sudden and aggressive summons to the subterranean safehouse. First was his loyal underboss, a man who had taken 2 bullets for Dominic during their violent rise to power. Next was his brutal enforcer, whose scarred knuckles were currently white from gripping his sidearm. Finally came his nervous accountant, the man who meticulously washed millions of dollars through offshore accounts every single week. Dominic stared at the 3 men who formed the untouchable pillars of his massive empire, knowing with absolute, sickening certainty that one of them had just tried to orchestrate his murder. "Someone fed my exact location to an assassin tonight," Dominic stated bluntly, letting the heavy words drop into the center of the room like a live grenade. The 3 men immediately erupted into defensive shouting, pulling their weapons and violently accusing each other of the ultimate betrayal. "Silence," Dominic roared, his voice booming off the concrete walls and instantly snapping the men back into rigid submission. "Until I find out exactly whose lips are loose, every single operation in this city is completely locked down. No shipments move, no money is transferred, and no one makes a single phone call without me listening on the other end." The accountant wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting frantically toward the corner where Clara was standing wrapped in the oversized cashmere coat. "Boss, who is the girl?" the accountant asked, his voice shaking noticeably under Dominic's lethal glare. "Is she the one who tipped you off about the poison?" Dominic stepped deliberately between his men and Clara, shielding her fragile frame from their intense and predatory scrutiny with his own broad shoulders. "She is under my absolute and unquestionable protection," Dominic declared, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. "And she is the only reason I am not currently lying on a morgue slab with a toe tag." He turned his back on his oldest friends, a gesture of profound disrespect that signaled the total collapse of their brotherhood, and looked directly at his enforcer. "Seize all of their communication devices and tear apart their financial records for the last 6 months," Dominic commanded ruthlessly. "Look for any unusual deposits, hidden properties, or unexplainable meetings. If I find even a single shadow of treason, I will personally carve the truth out of whoever sold me out." The room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence as the enforcer began disarming his own colleagues, the metallic clatter of expensive handguns hitting the steel table echoing like a death knell for their syndicate. Dominic gently placed his hand on the small of Clara's back, guiding her toward the heavily fortified exit of the underground bunker. He had successfully contained the immediate threat, but the venom of paranoia was already spreading rapidly through his veins. The circle of trust was permanently broken, and as they walked out into the dimly lit hallway, Dominic realized that this terrified young woman from the streets was now his most valuable asset and his most dangerous vulnerability in the brutal war that was about to consume the entire city. The sleek private elevator ascended rapidly to the 80th floor of the towering glass skyscraper, its silent mechanics a stark contrast to the violent chaos they had just escaped on the rain-swept streets below. The polished steel doors glided open to reveal Dominic Black's private penthouse, a sprawling fortress of floor-to-ceiling windows, dark Italian leather, and cold marble floors that overlooked the glittering expanse of the Chicago skyline. Clara stepped out of the elevator tentatively, her bare feet leaving damp footprints on the pristine white stone, her small frame still completely swallowed by his massive black cashmere coat. Heavy steel shutters instantly slammed down over the panoramic windows of the press of a remote button in his hand, sealing the luxurious apartment off from the outside world and transforming the opulent space into an impenetrable, brightly lit vault. Armed guards stood silently at the perimeter of the entryway, their faces completely void of any emotion, but Dominic immediately dismissed them with a sharp wave of his hand. Craving absolute isolation to process the devastating betrayal of his inner circle, he led Clara deeper into the massive living area, the sheer scale of his immense wealth clearly overwhelming to a young woman who had spent the last 2 months sleeping on cold concrete in a damp subway access tunnel. "You are perfectly safe here," Dominic said, his deep voice carrying a strange, unfamiliar gentleness as he watched her eyes dart nervously toward the heavy security cameras mounted in every corner of the ceiling. "No one knows about this property except the men who build it, and they are no longer breathing." Clara did not look comforted by that dark confession, her sharp gaze instead analyzing the reinforced steel frames of the doors and the biometric scanners lining the hallway with the hyper-vigilant awareness of a true survivor. "A cage is still a cage, Mr. Black, no matter how much gold you use to build the bars," she replied softly, her voice remarkably steady despite the visible trembling of her slender hands. Dominic paused, genuinely surprised by the razor-sharp observation coming from a woman who by all accounts should be paralyzed by raw fear. He walked over to a dark mahogany wet bar and poured a glass of amber liquid, his strategic mind racing with the deadly, sprawling implications of Marcus Thorne returning from the grave to dismantle his life's work. He turned back to offer her the drink, but Clara had already moved toward the absolute center of the room, her ingrained survival instincts keeping her far away from any dangerous blind spots or heavy closed doors. "You need dry clothes and hot food," Dominic stated, setting the heavy crystal glass down on the marble counter and pressing an intercom button to order his private staff to prepare a meal immediately. "There is a guest bedroom down the west hall with a fully stocked bathroom, and you will find clothes in the wardrobe that should fit you." Clara hesitated, her defensive posture practically vibrating with raw, unfiltered street smarts as she calculated her next move. "Why are you actually keeping me alive?" she asked, her dark eyes piercing straight through his carefully constructed facade of ruthless, untouchable authority. "You have my exact description of the man who poisoned you, and you have your massive army of soldiers to go hunt him down. I am just a massive liability to a man in your position." Dominic slowly closed the distance between them, his imposing physical presence forcing her to tilt her head up just to maintain their intense eye contact. "Because you noticed the nervous tick in his fingers and the exact tailoring of his expensive suit while you were pretending to be asleep in a pitch-black tunnel," Dominic explained, his voice dropping into a low, mesmerizing cadence that filled the quiet room. Because you did not run away when my men pulled their weapons in the restaurant tonight, and because you possess a raw survival instinct that most of my highly trained enforcers completely lack. He reached out slowly, his large, scarred hand gently brushing a damp lock of tangled hair away from her pale cheek, a surprisingly intimate gesture that sent a visible shiver down her spine. Marcus Thorne knows absolutely everything about how my criminal syndicate operates, which means I cannot trust my own security protocols or the men I have bled beside for 15 years, Dominic continued, his dark eyes searching hers for any sign of deception or weakness. But Marcus does not know you, Clara. You are the only unpredictable variable in a deadly chess match where my opponent has already memorized all of my moves. Clara held her breath, the intoxicating scent of expensive cologne and faint gunpowder radiating off his tailored suit wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. She had spent her entire tragic life being entirely invisible, overlooked and casually discarded by a broken society. But the most dangerous man in Chicago was currently looking at her like she was the most valuable asset he had ever discovered. If I help you navigate this underworld war, Clara countered, her chin lifting with a fierce, undeniable pride that completely defied her ragged appearance and soaked hair, I am not doing it for your criminal empire or your dirty blood money. I am doing it because that monster tried to use my life as a disposable test run, and I want to watch you tear his world apart. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Dominic's hardened features, a rare expression of genuine predatory respect that he usually reserved for his most lethal rivals. The entire power dynamic in the lavish room subtly shifted, the thick tension between them evolving from the cold detachment of a captive and a captor into the simmering, electric intrigue of two broken survivors recognizing the exact same ruthless darkness in each other. Then go get warm, Clara, Dominic murmured, stepping back to give her space, but unable to completely tear his eyes away from her defiant gaze. Because starting tomorrow, we are going to burn Marcus Thorne's resurrected empire straight to the absolute ground. The heavy rainfall from the previous night had completely faded into a thick, suffocating fog that rolled off the freezing waters of Lake Michigan and completely swallowed the industrial shipping yards. Dominic Black stood in the deep shadows of a rusted storage container, his tactical gear blending perfectly into the pitch-black darkness, his customized assault rifle resting comfortably against his broad chest. Beside him stood Clara, completely transformed from the shivering, soaked girl in the restaurant into a silent, hyper-vigilant observer wearing dark-fitted cargo pants and a heavy ballistic vest that Dominic had personally secured over her small frame. He had explicitly broken every single operational role by bringing a civilian into an active combat zone, but after realizing his entire inner circle was fundamentally compromised, keeping Clara within arm's reach was the only tactical decision that made any logical sense to his paranoid mind. She had been the one to point out a crucial detail from her time in the subway tunnels, remembering Marcus muttering about a specific shipping container serial number starting with the letters MT. A massive ego stroke for a dead man that Dominic instantly recognized as the exact location of his $3 million weapons shipment. "Stay exactly behind me and do not make a single sound," Dominic whispered, his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the rhythmic lapping of the dark water against the wooden piers. Clara nodded firmly, her heart hammering violently against her ribs, the adrenaline of the imminent ambush sharpening her street-smart senses to a razor edge. Through the thick gray fog, the muffled sound of heavy boots crunching on wet gravel echoed across the empty loading dock. Four men dressed in unmarked tactical gear emerged from the mist, carrying specialized thermal cutting torches and heavy duffel bags designed to haul away high-grade military explosives. Dominic watched them approach with the cold, calculating patience of an apex predator, his earpiece completely silent because he had deliberately chosen to leave his trusted lieutenants completely in the dark about this specific intersection. He had only brought a hand-picked squad of low-level soldiers who had absolutely no ties to Marcus Thorne's previous regime, positioning them silently on the rusted catwalks above the concrete loading zone. As the lead saboteur sparked a bright blue flame from his cutting torch and stepped toward the heavy steel doors of the targeted shipping container, Dominic raised his rifle and fired a single, deafening shot that shattered the eerie silence of the docks. The heavy-caliber bullet struck the metal lock housing directly next to the saboteur's hand, sending a shower of brilliant orange sparks into the dark air. "Drop your weapons and get on your knees," Dominic's voice boomed over a hidden loudspeaker, vibrating with absolute, terrifying authority. The four mercenaries instantly scattered, diving behind a stack of wooden shipping pallets as a chaotic storm of suppressed gunfire erupted from the catwalks above. Concrete chipped and splintered violently around them, the deafening echoes of the shootout masking the sound of Clara gasping as she pressed her back flat against the freezing steel of the container. Dominic moved with terrifying, practiced lethal grace, stepping out of the shadows and neutralizing two of the dancing mercenaries with precise, calculated shots to their lower extremities, completely disabling them without ending their lives because he desperately needed answers. The remaining two men threw down their weapons in absolute surrender, raising their hands as Dominic's loyal soldiers quickly descended from the catwalks and violently kicked the empty rifles away into the dark water below. The entire ambush had lasted less than 90 seconds, a flawless tactical victory that should have flooded Dominic's veins with triumphant relief, but a cold, sickening knot of profound realization suddenly began to tighten in the pit of his stomach. He walked slowly toward the bleeding leader of the sabotage team, grabbing him violently by the collar of his tactical vest and hauling him up to his knees. "Where is Marcus Thorne?" Dominic demanded, pressing the hot barrel of his rifle directly under the man's chin. The mercenary just coughed, a dark, bloody smile spreading across his bruised face. "He is nowhere near here, Black," the man wheezed, his eyes filled with fanatical devotion to a ghost. "He told us he would be too fast, too smart to let the shipment go without a fight. He just wanted to see exactly how long it would take you to show up, and exactly which of your trusted dogs you would bring to the fight." Dominic's blood turned to absolute ice as the devastating truth crashed into his mind with the force of a physical blow. He looked around the foggy docks, realizing that the four men bleeding on the concrete were nothing more than sacrificial pawns, cheap distractions sent to measure his response time and analyze his current troop deployment. Marcus had not come to steal the weapons at all. The resurrected king was simply testing the perimeter fences of Dominic's empire, looking for the weakest point to strike the fatal blow. Clara stepped cautiously out of the shadows, her dark eyes quickly analyzing the scattered equipment the mercenaries had dropped on the ground. "Mr. Black," she called out, her voice urgent but tightly controlled. "Look at the bags they brought." Dominic released the bleeding man and walked over to where Clara was standing, kneeling down to inspect the heavy canvas duffel bags. They were completely empty. There were no secondary explosives, no rigging equipment, nothing designed to actually steal or destroy a $3 million arms cache. It was a stopwatch, Dominic whispered to himself, the terrifying genius of Marcus's strategy making his jaw clench in raw, unadulterated fury. He intentionally leaked the target so my traitor would feed it back to me, knowing I would abandon my penthouse to secure the port. He was timing my exact reaction. The blaring ring of his encrypted satellite phone suddenly shattered the tense silence of the foggy docks. Dominic pulled the device from his tactical vest, his stomach dropping as he saw the caller identification. It was his private security detail stationed at the underground financial vault on the opposite side of the city, the exact location where his accountant stored the physical ledgers and offshore routing numbers that controlled his entire massive fortune. "Voss," the panicked voice of his guard crackled through the terrible static. "We're under heavy attack. It is a massive assault team. They just blew the reinforced steel doors. We need immediate backup." Dominic slowly lowered the phone, his dark eyes locking onto Clara's pale face as the sirens began to wail in the distant background of the call. The diversion at the docks had been a spectacular, flawlessly executed success. While Dominic was busy playing the role of the undisputed king, defending his valuable weapons, our resurrected ghost had just effortlessly walked right through the front door of his unguarded treasury, completely changing the fundamental roles of a war that Dominic was already losing. The blazing sirens of the compromised financial vault faded into the distance as Dominic aggressively steered the armored vehicle away from the burning wreckage of his immediate wealth, his mind completely consumed by the devastating reality that he was fighting a heavily funded ghost. He navigated the heavy truck deep into the decaying, forgotten industrial sector of the South Side, an area of Chicago that had once belonged entirely to Marcus Thorne before Dominic violently claimed the throne 15 years ago. Clara sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the cracked pavement and flickering streetlights of the familiar slums where she had recently fought to survive, perfectly understanding the desperate, hungry energy radiating from the crumbling brick buildings. Dominic slammed the brakes in front of an abandoned, windowless textile factory that secretly housed an underground medical clinic designed specifically for bullet wounds and off-the-books reconstructive surgeries. He killed the engine and pulled a heavy customized handgun from his holster, turning to look at the young woman who had somehow become his most crucial tactical advisor. The man inside this building is named Silas, a disgraced surgeon who used to patch up our worst mistakes, Dominic explained, his deep voice carrying a lethal, quiet intensity in the dark cavern. If Marcus survived that car fire 15 years ago, Silas is the only man in this entire city capable of faking the dental records and keeping a burning man alive long enough to disappear. Clara nodded, her sharp survival instincts completely overriding her lingering fear as she followed the towering Mafia boss out into the freezing rain and down a steep flight of concrete stairs leading into the subterranean basement. Dominic did not bother knocking, instead kicking the heavy metal door completely off its rusted hinges, the deafening crash sending a half-dozen heavily tattooed enforcers scrambling for their weapons in the dimly lit waiting room. Dominic moved with terrifying, blinding speed, disarming two men with brutal, bone-breaking precision while firing a single warning shot directly into the concrete ceiling that instantly froze the remaining guards in absolute terror. "I am only here for the doctor," Dominic roared, his voice echoing through the sterile, bleach-scented corridors like a literal force of nature. A frail, terrified older man in a blood-stained surgical apron slowly emerged from the back operating room, his hands trembling violently as he recognized the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld standing in his ruined doorway. Dominic grabbed the doctor by the throat and slammed him against the tiled wall, the violent impact rattling the glass cabinets filled with illicit pharmaceuticals. "Marcus Thorne is alive, Silas, and you are going to tell me exactly who paid you to put another man in his burning car 15 years ago," Dominic snarled, the pure, unadulterated venom in his tone promising a slow, agonizing death. The doctor gasped for air, his eyes bulging with sheer terror as he desperately clawed at the massive hand crushing his windpipe. "It was not just me, Dominic, I swear to God," the old surgeon choked out, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. He was burned so badly, his left arm was completely melted to the bone. He needed specialized grafts, offshore rehabilitation, things that cost millions of dollars. Dominic tightened his grip, his dark eyes burning with murderous intent. "Who funded the resurrection, Silas?" he demanded, pressing the barrel of his handgun directly against the doctor's temple. The old man began to weep, fully realizing that a ghost from the past had finally come back to drag them all straight to hell. "I do not know the actual name of the organization. They only ever communicated through blind wire transfers from a private Swiss bank account," Silas cried out, desperately pleading for his miserable life. Clara, who had been standing silently near the shattered doorway observing the brutal interrogation with the hypervigilance of a seasoned street survivor, suddenly noticed a heavily secured steel filing cabinet tucked away in the dark corner of the office behind the doctor. She stepped carefully around the paralyzed guards, her dark eyes locking onto the slight, unnatural wear pattern on the bottom drawer that suggested it was opened far more frequently than the others. "Mr. Black," Clara called out, her calm, steady voice slicing through the chaotic tension of the room. "Ask him where he keeps the physical routing slips for the offshore transfers, because a man who runs an illegal clinic definitely keeps a blackmail ledger to protect himself." The doctor's eyes widened in absolute panic, his gaze instinctively darting toward the exact steel cabinet Clara had just singled out, instantly confirming her brilliant deduction. Dominic dropped the gasping surgeon to the tiled floor in a heap and walked over to the cabinet, raising his weapon and shooting the heavy padlock clean off the metal drawer. He violently yanked it open, sifting through the disorganized medical files until he found a leather-bound ledger entirely out of place among the bloody patient records. Dominic opened the thick book, his eyes quickly scanning the faded ink and perfectly recorded account numbers dating back 15 years to the exact week of Marcus Thorne's supposed demise. The staggering sums of money transferred into the doctor's accounts were meticulously documented, but it was the recurring signature authorizing the massive payments that made Dominic's blood run completely cold. It was not a rival crime family or a mysterious foreign syndicate that had bankrolled the resurrection of his greatest enemy. The signature belonged to Eddie, Dominic's own nervous, unassuming accountant, the very man who managed his entire financial empire and who had sat across from him at the dinner table just 24 hours ago. The devastating betrayal hit Dominic like a physical knife twisting deep into his chest, entirely rewriting the history of his undisputed reign. Eddie had not just leaked the restaurant location to Marcus. He had been systematically funding the ghost for over a decade, using Dominic's own money to finance the weapons, the mercenaries, and the highly calculated destruction of his empire. The massive conspiracy was finally unearthed, but as the blaring sirens of approaching police cruisers began to echo down the concrete stairs, Dominic realized that the man who controlled all of his money was now actively hunting them, and the Viper was preparing to strike from the shadows. The blaring sirens that echoed down the concrete stairs were not police cruisers arriving to shut down the illegal clinic, but rather a highly coordinated execution squad sent by a nervous accountant who desperately needed to bury his 15-year-old secret. Dominic realized the lethal deception the exact second a heavy tear gas canister bounced violently through the shattered doorway and exploded into a thick cloud of suffocating white smoke. "Get down," Dominic roared, grabbing Clara by the heavy ballistic vest and dragging her roughly behind a massive rusted autoclave as the first wave of automatic gunfire shredded the sterile medical room. Glass cabinets exploded into thousands of jagged shards, and the terrified guards Dominic had previously spared were instantly mowed down by faceless mercenaries swarming into the confined basement. The deafening roar of customized assault rifles inside the echoing concrete chamber was absolute agony on the eardrums, but Dominic returned fire with devastating precision, dropping two heavily armored killers with calculated shots through the thick smoke. He was a cornered king fighting with the brutal, unmatched ferocity that had originally won him the underworld throne, but even he could not hold off an entire tactical squad in a room with only one main exit. Eddie sent his personal cleanup crew. Dominic shouted to Clara over the deafening cacophony of shattering tiles and ricocheting bullets, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "He drained my accounts to buy a private army, and now he is trapping us in a concrete coffin." The mercenaries began to advance slowly behind heavy ballistic shields, laying down a merciless wall of suppressing fire that completely pinned Dominic behind the deteriorating metal machinery. A high-caliber round tore violently through the heavy steel beside Dominic's head, spraying his face with burning hot shrapnel and forcing him to drop low to the blood-soaked floor. For the first time in 2 decades, the untouchable Mafia boss of Chicago was entirely trapped, outgunned, and rapidly running out of ammunition. Clara pressed her hands tightly over her ears, her chest heaving as she swallowed the burning tear gas. but her dark eyes were frantically scanning the chaotic layout of the underground clinic with the desperate brilliance of a street survivor who had spent her entire life finding impossible exits. She looked past the advancing wall of mercenaries and focused entirely on the massive industrial ventilation shafts running along the crumbling brick ceiling above them. "Mr. Black," Clara coughed violently, pointing a shaking finger toward a large rusted grate located directly over a cluster of pressurized oxygen tanks near the back operating theater. The old factory ventilation system connects straight into the abandoned subway tunnels. I used to crawl through them to stay warm during the winter. Dominic followed her gaze, instantly understanding the suicidal but brilliant geometry of her desperate plan. "If I shoot those tanks, the entire back half of this clinic is going to detonate," Dominic warned her, his dark eyes locking onto hers as another storm of bullets ripped into the autoclave sheltering them. "We will have exactly 3 seconds to jump into that access tunnel before the shockwave incinerates everything in this room." Clara nodded fiercely, her survival instincts entirely overriding her raw terror as she crawled onto her hands and knees, positioning herself right at the edge of their temporary cover. "Do it," she yelled, her voice breaking but completely resolute. Dominic slammed his last fresh magazine into his weapon and stood up into the direct line of fire, roaring like a wounded lion as he unleashed a relentless hail of bullets against the advancing ballistic shields. The mercenaries momentarily staggered back from the sheer, overwhelming ferocity of his counterattack, giving Dominic the exact split second he needed to pivot his weapon toward the towering cluster of green oxygen tanks. He fired 3 rapid shots directly into the pressurized valves and instantly dove toward Clara, grabbing her small waist and launching them both toward the crumbling brick wall beneath the ventilation grate just as a deafening, catastrophic explosion ripped through the confined basement. A massive shockwave of searing orange flame and pulverized concrete completely engulfed the medical clinic, blowing the heavy mercenaries violently backward and instantly melting the ballistic shields. The devastating concussive force practically lifted Dominic and Clara off the ground, tossing them brutally into the dark, narrow opening of the rusted maintenance shaft. The air was entirely sucked out of their lungs as the subterranean ceiling began to collapse behind them, burying the burning execution squad under tons of twisted steel and shattered concrete. Dominic coughed violently, his ears ringing with a piercing, unbearable frequency as he dragged himself up from the filthy floor of the dark subway tunnel. He was bleeding heavily from a deep laceration on his forehead and his expensive clothes were completely coated in thick gray ash, but he was impossibly alive. He looked down at the young woman lying beside him in the pitch-black dirt, her face covered in soot, but her dark eyes burning with an undeniable, fierce defiance. The accountant had spent millions of dollars to orchestrate a flawless, inescapable ambush in a subterranean tomb, but he had entirely failed to account for a desperate girl who knew the hidden banes of the city better than anyone else. Clara slowly pushed herself up to her knees, wincing as she wiped the blood from a scrape on her cheek, and looked at the most feared man in Chicago who was now just as homeless and hunted as she was. "Your money is gone and your men are all trying to kill you," Clara stated bluntly, her breath coming in ragged, exhausted gasps as the distant fires crackled behind the collapsed tunnel wall. Dominic wiped the blood from his own eyes, a terrifying, predatory smile slowly spreading across his ruined face as he fully embraced the absolute destruction of his gilded empire. "Eddie took my money and Marcus took my throne," Dominic rasped, his voice dropping into a lethal, chilling register that promised a level of violence Chicago had never witnessed before. "But they completely failed to take my life, and tomorrow, I am going to make them both pay for that mistaken blood." The suffocating darkness of the abandoned subway tunnels offered a temporary sanctuary from the blazing inferno they had just narrowly escaped, but the frigid underground air felt heavy with the promise of inevitable violence. Dominic Black moved through the pitch-black labyrinth with the predatory silence of a wounded animal, his expensive suit ruined and soaked with his own blood, while his massive hand kept a tight grip on Clara's trembling arm. She navigated the treacherous debris with the instinctual muscle memory of a girl who had spent the last 2 months surviving in the absolute darkest fanes of Chicago. Her small frame moving swiftly over rusted tracks and shattered concrete without making a single sound. The devastating betrayal of his trusted accountant had stripped Dominic of his vast fortune and his loyal army, but the raw, unadulterated fury pumping through his veins made him far more dangerous than he had ever been sitting on a gilded throne. There is an old maintenance hatch 3 miles north that opens into an unmarked garage, Dominic whispered, his deep voice barely a harsh rasp against the dripping water echoing in the tunnel. I have a heavily armored vehicle stored there that Eddie does not know about, completely off the books and fully loaded with military-grade weaponry. Clara nodded in the darkness, her chest heaving as she struggled to keep pace with his long, urgent strides. If Marcus and Eddie control your empire, they will have every single exit out of this city locked down tight, she warned him, her sharp mind already calculating the terrifying odds of their survival. Dominic suddenly stopped, pulling her close to his chest as his hyper-vigilant ears caught the faint, metallic scrape of heavy combat boots echoing from the narrow tunnel directly ahead of them. They were not alone in the dark. Before Dominic could raise his nearly empty weapon, the entire subterranean corridor was violently illuminated by the blinding glare of high-powered tactical flashlights mounted on customized assault rifles. A dozen heavily armored mercenaries stepped out from the shadows, their weapons trained directly on Dominic's chest, completely blocking the only path to the surface. And then, stepping slowly from behind the impenetrable wall of hired killers, the ghost finally materialized. Marcus Thorne looked exactly as Clara had described him, tall and imposing in a charcoal suit that hung loosely on his frame, the silver hair at his temples catching the harsh, artificial light. He stopped 20 feet away from them, raising his left hand to casually adjust his collar, intentionally revealing the horrific, melted scar tissue creeping up from his wrist. "You always were incredibly difficult to kill," Dominic, Marcus said, his voice is smooth, chilling baritone that sent a profound shudder down Dominic's spine, echoing with the ghosts of a 15-year-old brotherhood that had ended in fire. "Eddie told me you would run for the maintenance hatch if you somehow survived the clinic, but I honestly did not believe you still had the raw stamina." Dominic stepped deliberately in front of Clara, shielding her small body completely from the blinding tactical lights, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth threatened to shatter. "You should have stayed dead, Marcus," Dominic growled, the venom dripping from every syllable. "Because when I walk out of this tunnel, I am going to rip your head off your shoulders with my bare hands." Marcus let out a dark, raspy laugh that held absolutely no humor. "You are not walking out of this tunnel, old friend, but you are also not dying today," Marcus replied smoothly, his cold eyes shifting past Dominic to lock onto the terrified young woman trembling behind his broad shoulders. "Because Eddie informed me that the ruthless, untouchable king of Chicago just risked his entire billion-dollar empire and his own life to protect a homeless street rat he met 24 hours ago." Dominic felt his blood turn to absolute ice as a sniper laser suddenly appeared directly on the center of Clara's forehead, the bright red dot sealing her devastating fate. "Drop the weapon, Dominic, or I paint the walls with her brains right now," Marcus ordered, all trace of amusement completely vanishing from his lethal tone. Dominic froze entirely, his tactical mind violently cycling through a dozen different scenarios, all of them ending with Clara bleeding out on the dirt floor. He had spent 2 decades building an empire where he cared about absolutely nothing and no one, a ruthless philosophy that had made him entirely invulnerable to leverage. But the girl shivering behind him had somehow cracked the impenetrable armor around his cold heart. With a heavy, sickening thud, Dominic dropped his customized handgun onto the rusted train tracks, raising his empty hands in absolute, bitter surrender. 2 heavily armored mercenaries immediately rushed forward, slamming the butt of a rifle violently into Dominic's ribs and dropping the massive Mafia boss to his knees in the dirt. Clara screamed as brutal hands grabbed her by the heavy ballistic vest, violently ripping her away from Dominic's protective shadow. She fought like a cornered wildcat, kicking and clawing at the armored giants, her tragic resilience refusing to break even as they aggressively dragged her toward the resurrected king. "Let her go," Dominic roared, spitting blood onto the concrete as a heavy combat boot pressed firmly against the back of his neck, pinning him entirely to the floor. Marcus reached out and grabbed Clara tightly by the chin, forcing her to look into his dead, calculating eyes. "She is the key to everything," Marcus whispered, his scarred hand tracing the line of her jaw. "Tomorrow morning, Dominic, you are going to officially sign over every single port, every warehouse, and every offshore account to me in front of the syndicate bosses. You will publicly abdicate your throne, and in exchange, I might let this brave little girl live." The mercenaries began to drag Clara away into the suffocating darkness, her desperate screams echoing off the wet brick walls, tearing a massive, agonizing hole straight through Dominic's chest. Marcus looked down at his defeated rival one last time, a victorious smirk playing on his lips before he turned and disappeared into the shadows with his ultimate prize. As the heavy footsteps faded away, leaving Dominic completely alone, broken and bleeding in the pitch-black tunnel, the undisputed king of Chicago slowly pushed himself up from the dirt. He had lost his money, his men, and his throne, but as he listened to the silence of the underground, a terrifying, apocalyptic rage ignited in his soul. Marcus had made the ultimate, fatal mistake of leaving him breathing, and Dominic swore to the dark heavens that he would launch a merciless, catastrophic siege on the city, burning all of Chicago to ash if it meant getting Clara back. The rusted steel hatch groaned in the suffocating darkness as Dominic Black pushed his battered body up into the freezing air of the hidden garage, his veins burning with an apocalyptic rage that completely eclipsed his physical agony. He stumbled toward the massive tarp covering the off-the-books armored transport, tearing the heavy canvas away to reveal a militarized assault vehicle painted pitch black and loaded with enough raw firepower to level a small city block. He stripped off his ruined, blood-soaked suit jacket and strapped a heavy ballistic vest over his broad chest, loading customized high-caliber rifles, tactical shotguns, and heavy incendiary explosives into the tactical webbing with the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had already accepted his own death. Marcus Thorne had made the ultimate, fatal miscalculation of believing that stripping away Dominic's bank accounts and paid soldiers would render him powerless, entirely forgetting that Dominic had originally conquered the Chicago underworld with nothing but his bare hands and a terrifying willingness to burn everything to the ground. Dominic climbed into the driver's seat of the armored beast and fired the massive engine, the deafening roar echoing off the concrete walls like a war horn, before he slammed the transmission into gear and drove the heavy truck straight through the reinforced steel garage doors, shattering them into twisted shrapnel. He knew exactly where Marcus had taken Clara, a heavily fortified, half-constructed high-rise building overlooking the dark waters of the harbor. A towering concrete fortress that was supposed to serve as the crown jewel of Dominic's legitimate real estate empire before Eddie the accountant had quietly transferred the deed. The freezing rain lashed against the bulletproof windshield as Dominic navigated the desolate industrial streets at terrifying speeds, his dark eyes fixed on the skeletal silhouette of the skyscraper looming against the lightning-cracked sky. As the heavily guarded perimeter of the construction site came into view, Dominic did not even tap the brakes, instead pressing the accelerator straight to the floorboards. The armored vehicle launched violently over the concrete barricades and smashed directly through the chain-link gates, crushing two heavily armed mercenaries beneath its massive, reinforced tires before slamming brutally into the main support pillar of the ground floor lobby. The deafening impact shook the entire superstructure, but before the smoke and concrete dust could even begin to settle, Dominic kicked his shattered door open and stepped out into the chaotic debris, a customized tactical shotgun raised to his shoulder. He fired relentlessly, the thunderous blasts echoing through the cavernous concrete shell as he systematically dismantled the first wave of Marcus's private army, blowing mercenaries violently off their feet with ruthless, calculated precision. He did not seek cover, moving with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a natural disaster, tossing heavy incendiary grenades into the makeshift guard posts and watching the bright orange flames consume the men who had dared to betray him. Dominic fought his way up the raw concrete stairwells, leaving a brutal trail of shattered bodies and smoking shell casings in his wake, his dark eyes burning with the singular, obsessive goal of reaching the top floor before Marcus could execute his ultimate leverage. He kicked open the heavy fire door leading to the penthouse level, stepping out onto a massive, wind-swept expanse of exposed concrete that hovered 80 stories above the glittering city lights. Marcus Thorne stood at the far edge of the dizzying drop, holding a terrified, shivering Clara by the collar of her heavy vest, the barrel of his silver handgun pressed directly against her temple. Standing nervously slightly behind Marcus was Eddie, the traitorous accountant clutching a metal briefcase filled with the stolen routing numbers, his face pale with absolute terror as he stared at the blood-soaked, unstoppable monster he had foolishly tried to bury. "You are completely insane, Dominic," Marcus shouted over the howling wind, his scarred hand trembling slightly as he tightened his grip on the young woman. "You brought an entire war to my doorstep for a street girl who means absolutely nothing to this syndicate." Dominic dropped his empty shotgun onto the concrete, his broad chest heaving as he stared at Clara, whose dark eyes were wide with sheer terror but shone with a fierce, unbreakable resilience that anchored his chaotic soul. "She means absolutely everything," Dominic roared, his voice carrying a lethal, chilling promise of absolute destruction. Before Marcus could tighten his finger on the trigger, Dominic reached down and pulled a customized flare gun from his tactical belt, but he did not aim it at the resurrected king. He pointed the weapon directly at the massive, exposed pallets of highly volatile construction explosives stacked haphazardly right behind the accountant. He fired without a single second of hesitation, the bright red flare arcing through the freezing rain and striking the explosive cache with catastrophic precision. The deafening detonation ripped through the top floor, an explosive shockwave of blistering heat and pulverized concrete that instantly vaporized the screaming accountant and blew Marcus violently backward toward the dizzying edge of the skyscraper. The resurrected ghost lost his footing on the slit concrete, his silver handgun clattering uselessly to the floor as he desperately grabbed the temporary scaffolding to keep from plummeting 80 stories to his death. Clara was thrown violently to her knees by the sheer force of the blast, but Dominic was already moving through the thick, choking smoke with blinding speed, dropping to the floor and wrapping his massive arms around her fragile body, shielding her entirely from the falling debris. As the explosive echoes finally faded into the howling wind, Dominic slowly stood up, pulling Clara safely behind his broad shoulders, his dark eyes locking onto the ruined, broken form of Marcus Thorne, who was now dangling helplessly over the terrifying abyss of the Chicago skyline. The merciless siege was finally over. The massive conspiracy was entirely dismantled in a symphony of fire and blood, and the undisputed king of the underworld had successfully ripped his most precious vulnerability from the jaws of a fatal end. The howling wind of the Chicago skyline tore through the exposed concrete of the 80th floor as Marcus Thorne dangled helplessly over the terrifying abyss. Dominic Black stepped slowly toward the ruined edge of his half-constructed skyscraper, his heavy boots crunching on shattered glass and pulverized stone. Marcus looked up, his silver hair plastered to his bleeding forehead by the freezing rain, his scarred fingers slipping violently against the wet steel scaffolding. "Pull me up, Dominic," the ghost pleaded, all of his arrogant, resurrected bravado completely erased by the sheer, dizzying drop into the dark city below. Dominic looked down at the man who had once been his brother, the man who had just orchestrated the slaughter of dozens of loyal men and forced a terrified young woman into the crosshairs of a ruthless syndicate war. Dominic did not reach out his massive hand to offer salvation, nor did he raise his customized weapon to deliver a final, bloody execution, because Marcus Thorne was already a dead man who had simply borrowed 15 extra years of breathing. Dominic turned his broad back on the begging ghost and walked slowly toward Clara, wrapping his heavy tactical coat tightly around her trembling shoulders just as a sickening, distant scream faded into the howling storm, officially ending the resurrected rebellion forever. 6 months later, the brutal scars of the Syndicate War had faded into absolute, unchallenged dominance. The restaurant went silent the moment Dominic Black walked through the gilded doors of his newly acquired dining establishment, but this time, the heavy silence was not born of imminent violence or hidden assassins. It was born of pure, unadulterated respect for the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld who had systematically purged his empire of every single traitor, re-establishing his iron grip on the city with a level of ruthlessness that terrified even his closest remaining allies. But the true source of the collective radiating from the wealthy patrons and hardened enforcers was the magnificent woman walking flawlessly by his side. Clara had completely transformed from a desperate, barefoot survivor hiding in an abandoned subway tunnel into a formidable, breathtaking force of nature. During the chaotic months of rebuilding, she had not just hidden in his heavily guarded penthouse, she had actively deciphered the encrypted offshore ledgers that the treacherous accountant had left behind, using her razor-sharp survival instincts to locate millions of dollars hidden in ghost accounts. She had mapped out brilliant new smuggling routes through the forgotten industrial sectors she knew so well, earning the terrifying, unwavering loyalty of Dominic's most brutal lieutenants. She wore a tailored crimson dress that moved like liquid fire, her dark hair swept up in an elegant style that perfectly framed her calculating, intelligent eyes. She did not flinch when the heavy security doors closed behind them, nor did she cower behind Dominic's imposing shadow, because she had walked through the absolute fires of hell with the most dangerous man in the city and had emerged entirely unbreakable. Dominic led her to the private mahogany table in the exact center of the room, pulling out her chair with a rare, genuine gentleness that he reserved exclusively for her. The perimeter was secured by loyal men who would gladly die for either of them, the security protocols completely rewritten under Clara's hyper-vigilant direction. As he sat across from the woman who had saved his life with a single, terrified warning, Dominic raised his crystal glass of expensive red wine, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a simmering, electric intensity that spoke of shared darkness and absolute, unwavering devotion. Clara smiled, a stunning, confident expression that commanded the entire room, raising her own glass to meet his, the delicate clinking sound echoing softly in the quiet dining space. She had traded a freezing concrete floor for a gilded throne, and in doing so, she had given the untouchable Mafia boss the one true thing his billions of dollars could never buy, an equal partner who understood exactly how to survive in a world built entirely on blood and betrayal. Their combined empire was now completely impenetrable, forged in the ashes of a brutal underworld war and cemented by a tragic survivor who had officially become the most powerful, feared woman in Chicago. As the king and his formidable queen enjoyed their peaceful, uninterrupted feast, the rest of the criminal syndicate finally understood that some bonds are forged so deeply in the darkness that absolutely nothing can ever break them. If you are captivated by Clara and Dominic's intense journey from a poisoned dinner to absolute underworld supremacy, make sure to hit that subscribe button and welcome to Sunni romance. We absolutely love bringing you these thrilling, high-stakes tales of dark devotion and unexpected heroes, so tell me down in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes during that terrifying restaurant scene?